Ethan Malone was 29 when a plain envelope arrived at his apartment, postmarked from a federal building he didn't recognize, containing a single typed line. Your father is alive. If you want to know why he's been gone 24 years, call this number. Ethan had attended his father's funeral when he was 5. There had been a casket. There had been a burial plot he'd visited every birthday since, alone, long after his mother stopped coming with him. Ethan grew up believing his father, David Malone, died in a single-vehicle collision on a rural highway 24 years earlier, a story confirmed by a death certificate, a police report, and a small newspaper obituary his mother kept in a drawer he wasn't supposed to open. What none of those documents mentioned was that no body had ever actually been recovered, a detail buried in a report Ethan wouldn't think to question until he was well into adulthood. David, 34 at the time, worked as a forensic accountant for a regional logistics company, Halbrook Transit Group, reviewing routine freight billing records when he identified a pattern of falsified shipping manifests moving through the company's Midwest division, a scheme later determined to be laundering an estimated $40 million annually on behalf of an organized crime network operating across 3 states. David reported the discrepancy to the FBI 11 days after first noticing it, a decision he later described in documents Ethan would eventually gain limited access to, as one he made before I let myself think too hard about what it would cost. He agreed to testify against the operations regional coordinator, a man named Victor Kessler, whose organization had a documented history of retaliating against cooperating witnesses. Federal marshals offered David's entire family relocation and new identities under the Witness Security Program. Ethan's mother, Diane, 31 at the time, made the decision, one she carried privately for over 2 decades, to decline full family relocation, wanting to preserve some continuity and family support for Ethan, rather than uproot a 5-year-old into a permanently anonymous life neither of them had chosen. With Diane and Ethan remaining under their own names, marshals determined the safest option was to sever all traceable connection between David and his family entirely, staging his death through a fabricated accident report rather than leaving any documented link, including divorce records or custody filings, that Kessler's associates might trace back to Diane and Ethan. Diane raised Ethan alone from that point forward, telling him, as he got older, only that his father had died in an accident before Ethan was old enough to remember him clearly, a story she maintained not out of dishonesty toward Ethan specifically, but because federal handlers had made unmistakably clear that any deviation risked exposing the very protection the fabrication existed to provide. Ethan's birthday fell in late September, the same month, it turned out, as the anniversary of David's staged death, a coincidence of timing Ethan wouldn't understand the significance of until decades later. Each year he visited a grave containing no body, an absence he described to a therapist in his 20s only as a hole I didn't know was shaped wrong until much later. Ethan became an investigative journalist, drawn, he'd later admit, to stories involving disappearances and cold cases in a pattern. His own therapist eventually connected to his father's death, or what he still believed, well into his 20s, had been an ordinary, senseless accident rather than anything requiring investigation. At 28, working on an unrelated personal genealogy project, Ethan requested a copy of his father's original accident report from the state archive, expecting a routine formality. What arrived instead was a report riddled with inconsistencies. No witness statements, no vehicle recovered, a case number that, when cross-referenced against public court dockets, appeared linked to an unrelated federal case sealed under a protective order. Ethan spent 4 months filing follow-up records requests, most returning heavily redacted or denied outright, until a sympathetic archivist suggested off the record that the pattern of redaction matched cases historically tied to federal witness protection. Ethan contacted the U.S. Marshals Service's Public Affairs Office directly, expecting another dead end. 6. Weeks later, a Marshals Service liaison, David Ferris, no relation, a coincidence Ethan found darkly funny given the surname, confirmed only that Ethan's inquiry had been forwarded appropriately and that someone would be in touch. The letter with no return address arrived 9 days after that call. David had requested limited marshal-supervised contact with his son specifically because Victor Kessler, the man whose testimony against him had triggered David's relocation, had died in federal prison 5 months earlier from pancreatic cancer, formally closing the active threat assessment that had kept David's identity sealed for over 2 decades. Marshals arranged the first meeting at a neutral federal building with security protocols Ethan found almost as disorienting as the reunion itself. Background checks, a supervised meeting room, explicit instructions not to photograph or publicly identify David's current name or location, even now, out of institutional caution rather than active threat. David was 58 now, grayer, quieter than any memory Ethan had ever half-trusted from early childhood. Time seemed to stand still as they sat across a government conference table, 2 strangers who shared a bloodline, and 24 years of a story only one of them had lived through consciously. David had rebuilt a life under a new identity in a different state, working as an accountant again under careful professional restrictions, remarried briefly in his 40s in a relationship that ended partly, he admitted, because he could never fully explain his own past to anyone, including a second wife who eventually left, rather than continue living alongside a silence she couldn't name. David produced from a worn canvas bag a scrapbook containing every public mention of Ethan he'd been legally permitted to access over the years. Newspaper bylines from Ethan's journalism career, a university graduation announcement, a local news clip from a youth soccer tournament Ethan had entirely forgotten winning at 11. David had followed his son's life from a distance for over 2 decades, forbidden from any contact, allowed only to watch. Ethan's first reaction wasn't relief. It was fury, a trembling anger at a system that had let his mother carry a fabricated grief alone for 24 years, and at a father who had chosen, even if legally compelled, a path that left a 5-year-old visiting an empty grave every September without explanation. Diane, now 55, received the news from Ethan directly rather than from the marshals, and her response surprised him. Relief, layered over decades of carefully controlled grief, admitting she'd wondered for years whether she'd made the right decision keeping Ethan's life stable rather than uprooting them both into permanent hiding alongside David. Ethan and David have met 6 times in the 8 months since that first federal conference room, each visit slightly less formal than the last, though marshals still coordinate logistics as a standard precaution given David's continued formal protection status. They speak by phone most weeks now, a routine Ethan describes as strange, in a way I don't think will ever fully stop feeling strange, but strange in a way I'd choose again. Rather than publishing his father's story directly, information the Marshal Service asked him not to disclose, in identifying detail, Ethan began reporting on the broader, under-examined toll witness protection places on the families left behind, interviewing over 40 relatives of protected witnesses nationally for a series examining the program's limited formal support for spouses and children who remain outside protection themselves. Ethan's series, published 14 months after that first federal meeting, contributed to congressional testimony supporting expanded counseling resources for families of protected witnesses, a policy gap advocacy groups had raised for years without the kind, sustained public attention Ethan's reporting, drawn directly from his own family's unresolved cost, finally brought to it. Ethan visited his father's grave one final time that September, not out of ritual grief this time, but to explain to the empty plot, somewhat absurdly he admitted, that he finally understood what it had actually been protecting. He hasn't gone back since. He didn't need to anymore. David didn't miss every birthday because he stopped being a father. He missed them because protecting his son required disappearing from the version of fatherhood that shows up in person, and the version that remained, watching quietly from a distance, forbidden from ever explaining why, was the only one the circumstances allowed him to keep. The lesson isn't that the system that separated them was good or fair. It's that love, even reduced to a scrapbook of newspaper clippings collected in total silence for 24 years, was never actually absent. It was just waiting the entire time for the one conversation it was never legally permitted to have.